He only wanted a plate of food for his little hungry sister. But a wealthy young man, eager to humiliate him, demanded a song in exchange. What that rich man didn't know was that this boy was about to change everyone's life in that place. Francisco is only 10 years old, but on his small shoulders rests the weight of a world most grown-ups could never carry. While other children dream of toys and playgrounds, he wakes up each day in a makeshift shelter, alert to the sound of his sister's cough and the silent groans of his mother, who lost her sight, but never her hope. The cold seeps through the cracks in the rotting wood like a nighttime thief, and Francisco's stomach growls louder than any alarm clock. In this world, survival isn't just a strong word, it's a verb, lived out daily, without pause. Little Clara, wrapped in blankets that no longer warm her, struggles to breathe. Pneumonia came as quickly as the food disappeared from their shelves. Francisco looks at her and feels urgency clawing at his chest. She needs antibiotics, real food, a chance. And he knows no one is going to magically show up with the answer. That's why he goes out into the streets, afraid, unsure if he'll make it back. Because for him, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's raw love turned into action. For his mother, anguish takes a different shape. Marta, blind, can smell misery before she even notices Francisco is gone again. She grips her daughter's warm little hand and pretends to be strong. But inside her, despair rises in silence. In a life where everything is lacking, the only thing they have in abundance is faith. But even faith doesn't fill a belly or bring down a fever. Each day, this family walks the edge of a razor blade. And yet, even in the deepest pain, something inside them refuses to die. That morning, before the sun touched the frozen ground of the city, Francisco knelt beside his sister, holding her feverish hand. With tearful eyes and a heart burning with urgency, he made a sacred promise. "Today, I'll come back with food and medicine, Clara. I swear." It wasn't just a pretty phrase, it was a silent vow between a boy and his faith. Between a lost childhood and the love that kept him going. To him, failure wasn't an option. That promise became fuel. It became fire in his steps. The recycling cart was bigger than he was, almost like an extension of his own body. As he dragged the noisy metal through the streets, he faced indifferent stares, dodged honking cars, endured humiliation. With each step, his fingers froze and hunger stabbed at his stomach like knives. But he kept going. Because when love is stronger than exhaustion, even a child becomes a warrior. And Francisco's war was against time, against neglect, against the hunger that bit without mercy. On one corner, a man refused to take the cans, but offered him an apple. And in that small gesture, Francisco felt something spark inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still kindness left in the world. He tucked the apple away like it was gold. Not for him, for Clara. Every coin he earned, every recyclable he stacked, he counted silently. Just a little more. I'm almost there. Yes, he was a child. But that day, driven by a promise and the weight of love, he walked like an invisible giant. Among adults who had long forgotten what it means to fight for someone you love. By the end of the day, Francisco's legs no longer moved like before. His arms ached from pushing the cart, his eyes burned from hunger and fatigue. But then, the smell of hot food reached his nose, and something inside him nearly collapsed. In front of Lichiel restaurant, a temple of luxury and indifference, Francisco stopped. He stared at the glowing windows, at the people laughing over glasses of wine, and felt like he was from another planet. It was as if that golden world existed only to remind him that his was made of dust. As he watched the plates being served, he could almost imagine the taste, even though he had never eaten anything like that in his life. His eyes followed each bite with a mix of awe and pain. That wasn't just food, it was a portrait of brutal inequality. He, who only wanted a piece of bread and some pills, stood there watching leftovers that could feed his family for days. His stomach growled loudly, but the voice inside him roared even louder. You made a promise. And you haven't kept it yet. In a surge of desperation and wounded dignity, he pushed the door open. He knew he could be thrown out. He knew he didn't belong in a place like that. But something was stronger than fear, his love for Clara, and the promise that still echoed in his mind. This wasn't about him. It was about what he had to do. With dirty feet but a clean heart, he stepped into that palace of luxury like someone entering enemy territory. No armor, but a soul on fire. And what happened inside would change everything. The moment Francisco crossed the restaurant's threshold, the world seemed to freeze, and then swallowed him whole with contempt. The maitre d', with eyes as sharp as knives, moved quickly to block him. "This place isn't for you, boy," he said coldly, with the ease of someone who's never known hunger. But before the boy could speak or turn back, an even crueler voice cut through the air. It was Rodrigo, the son of a powerful businessman, used to playing with other people's dignity the same way he'd toss a dirty napkin aside. Rodrigo smirked, as if spotting the perfect setup for some fun. "You want food," he said, holding up a barely touched plate. "Then sing. Right here, right now. Like a good little dog." Silence fell over the restaurant like a thunderclap. Forks paused mid-air. Laughter died. Everyone watched, not out of empathy, but curiosity. Francisco's hunger now wasn't just physical. It was the ache of having his humanity tested in front of an audience dressed in indifference. Standing at the center of that humiliating spectacle, Francisco held back his tears. Clara's eyes came to his mind. The promise. The apple in the cart. His mother's faith. Every word Rodrigo threw at him felt like a slap. But somehow, deep down, he knew this might be his last chance. With a trembling voice, ashamed and exposed, he opened his mouth. Not out of fear, but out of love. And at that very moment, something unexpected began to happen in the cold, glittering hall of that elite restaurant. Francisco took a deep breath and searched his memory for the melody his father used to sing on blackout nights. When the world seemed to collapse, but music still made them feel safe. The song was simple, sad, and sweet, like someone crying with a smile. As the first verses escaped his cracked lips, it wasn't just sound that filled the room. It was raw truth. An ancient pain wrapped in notes that pierced through crystal, porcelain, and pride, going straight to whatever was still human in the hearts around him. His voice wasn't trained, but it was real. He sang like someone who's surviving, like someone screaming gently. And that fragile purity, almost childlike, made silverware fall quietly onto plates, and eyes turned toward him in stunned silence. The humiliation Rodrigo had planned turned into something else. A kind of quiet reverence. Some guests held back tears without knowing why. Others looked away, ashamed. Ashamed that they had forgotten what it meant to feel. Without knowing it, Francisco was doing what most adults spend their whole lives trying to do. He was touching souls. In that moment, the boy who entered as a social problem became living poetry. The pain he carried became a bridge. And the notes that echoed through that hall weren't just words. They were pleas. They were promises. They were fragments of stories that no one at those tables had ever dared to face within themselves. Francisco didn't sing to impress. He didn't sing to move anyone. He sang because he had to. And each verse released into that room seemed to announce that something was about to happen. Something that could no longer be stopped. At the back of the room, an elegant man with tired eyes was the first to stand. Mr. Valenka, known for his silent profits and lonely dinners, had tears in his eyes. That song had stirred something buried deep. Maybe a memory. Maybe a long-hidden wound. He, who had grown used to the emotional silence of the rich, now felt his chest tremble at the voice of a child from the streets. It wasn't just music. It was a cry for help. And this time, he knew. He couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. With trembling hands, he started the first round of applause. Shy at first, almost awkward. But then it spread like a wave. And the clapping wasn't just for Francisco. It was for something everyone there secretly longed to reclaim. The ability to be moved. Valenka no longer saw a dirty, hungry boy. He saw bravery. He saw love. And something inside him, dormant for years, finally woke up, with force. The loneliness he had built like a fortress began to crumble. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to act. With steady steps, he approached the breathless boy. He knelt down to his eye level, not as a benefactor, but as someone who had finally remembered what it means to be human. "From this day forward, your struggle is mine too," he said, gently placing a hand on Francisco's shoulder. In that gesture, something was sealed. It wasn't pity, it was commitment. And in that moment, without realizing it, Valenka wasn't just changing a boy's life. He was beginning a journey that would change his own. Francisco stood frozen, unsure if what was happening was real or just a strange dream conjured by hunger. But when Valenka took his hand and led him to a polished table in the center of the restaurant, everything became clear. "Today, you're not a beggar," he said. "You're my guest of honor." The words struck like lightning. The stares of the other guests, once filled with disgust, now followed with reverent silence. Francisco sat down with trembling legs, trying to grasp how, in just minutes, he had gone from humiliation to honor. The table was set with care, shining silverware, plates full of warm food, napkins folded like origami. But what fed Francisco most in that moment wasn't the food. It was the respect. For the first time in his life, someone looked him in the eyes, treated him with dignity. Valenka didn't say much, but every gesture whispered, "You matter." And for a boy who had always lived as if invisible, that meant more than any feast. As he ate slowly, savoring every bite, Francisco felt something begin to shift deep inside him. Then Valenka leaned in, speaking with the calm voice of someone who had seen too much. "Francisco, life can be unfair. But you've shown me that beauty still survives in the most unexpected places. I want to help you. But more than that, I want to show you a new path." And right there, between hot meals and words even warmer, Francisco understood. Maybe there really were other worlds. And maybe he had just stepped into one. A world where hope wasn't just a pretty word. It was a real possibility. The next day, Valenka didn't send anyone in his place. He went himself. He wore simple clothes, dismissed the driver, and walked all the way to the address Francisco had scribbled on a dirty napkin. When he arrived at the old abandoned tire shop the family called home, he didn't find misery. He found resilience. The floor was cold. The walls were damp. But there was something inside that no money could ever buy: love. Marta, though blind, stood with dignity as soon as she heard footsteps. "Welcome," she said, with the firmness of someone who still believes in the goodness of people. Valenka needed a few seconds to collect himself. When he saw little Clara curled up on a thin mattress, struggling to breathe, his eyes filled with tears. The girl smiled with the same sweetness Francisco carried in his voice. There was no drama in those walls, just everyday courage. He felt ashamed of the times he had called himself lonely in his mansion, while a blind mother shared dry bread with her children and still found strength to be kind. That small, cold room taught him more about wealth than any boardroom ever had. "I didn't come here out of charity. I came for justice," he said, voice tight with emotion. He promised that this broken tire shop would be just a chapter of the past. That Clara would have the medicine, the food, and the care she needed. That Marta would have support, respect, and safety. And that Francisco, this little giant, would have every tool to choose a different future. And as he looked at that family, piecing together happiness from scraps, Valenka realized something profound. The promise he was making now was also a promise to himself. Marta had always been more than eyes. Even blind, she saw the world with a clarity many would never reach. Raising 2 children alone in the depths of poverty had taught her that pride can be a kind of armor. That's why, when Valenka offered help, her heart locked up. Not from ingratitude, but from fear. Fear of depending on someone. Shame of seeming weak. She knew what it felt like to be discarded by society. And now, once again, she faced a choice. Protect her pride, or save her daughter. But Clara's cough didn't wait for permission. It tore through the silence like a knife. It was a sound Marta knew well, not just a cough, but a warning. It was her daughter's life crying out for help. And in that moment, all defenses crumbled. She reached out until she found Francisco's trembling hand. Then she turned her face toward Valenka's voice and spoke with a mix of strength and vulnerability. "My sight is gone, but my love as a mother is not." Those words cut through the air like undeniable truth. Valenka, who had heard countless speeches in his life of wealth and power, had never heard anything as powerful as that single sentence. In that moment, Marta wasn't surrendering in defeat. She was surrendering as a mother in her purest form. Her love, blind and immense, was what finally allowed help to enter. And as her heart opened to this new reality, something quiet began to ignite around them. The certainty that this family's future was about to change forever. Valenka understood the difference between giving charity and offering a new path. That's why his gesture toward Francisco and his family didn't come with a label of pity. It came with the seal of dignity. He didn't show up with grocery bags for a photo op. He didn't bring pre-packaged words of compassion. He showed up with keys. Keys to a real home, with a warm bed, solid walls, and a fridge that didn't echo when opened. But more than physical comfort, he offered something that few had ever given that family: respect. "I don't want your gratitude. I want you to walk beside me," he said calmly, as he showed them the new apartment, simple yet welcoming. For Marta, it felt like breathing again. For Clara, it was the relief her fragile body had been begging for. And for Francisco, it was a silent shock. To realize that someone believed in him, not out of pity, but from conviction. Valenka saw the raw talent in that boy with the deep eyes. And he didn't want to buy it, he wanted to awaken it. Francisco, used to being invisible on the city's sidewalks, was now receiving an invitation that would change everything. To become the protagonist of his own story. Valenka didn't see a pitiful kid. He saw a rare soul, one molded by pain, forged in struggle. And in that silent pact between a wealthy man and a hungry boy, something bigger began to take shape. It wasn't just a change of address. It was a calling, a beginning, a first step toward something no one could yet fully imagine. While Francisco's life began to blossom in new soil, Rodrigo, the rich young man from the restaurant, watched from afar with poisoned eyes. What to many looked like a miracle, to him felt like an insult. He couldn't bear to see someone like Francisco, dirty, poor, invisible, gaining attention, affection, a future. Wounded in his pride, Rodrigo didn't just want to ignore the change. He wanted to destroy it. And when powerful people want to sabotage someone, they don't always use weapons. They use words, status, influence. And Rodrigo had plenty of all three. He began to spread lies. He said Francisco was a fraud, that Valenka was being manipulated, that Marta was using her daughter to gain sympathy. With fake smiles and real connections, he planted doubts in all the right ears. The police showed up out of nowhere. A new neighbor began asking too many questions. What once looked like hope now began to feel like a threat. Rodrigo knew that prejudice disguised as justice was his most subtle and cruel weapon. And the system, often blind, was easy to sway. In a short time, the family began living under suspicion. Marta was summoned for questioning. Clara was watched by eyes pretending to care, but full of judgment. Francisco, confused and quiet, began to feel that old sensation again, of being measured, tested, disbelieved. Rodrigo didn't just want to take away what they had gained. He wanted to prove they should never have had anything at all. And that's when the real battle began. A battle where truth would have to shout louder than the lie. That morning, the doorbell rang cold and sharp. 2 police officers arrived, clipboards in hand, with technical stares. They said there had been an anonymous report about alleged child neglect. Marta wasn't surprised. The pain of prejudice was nothing new. It had just arrived this time wearing a new name, procedure. Still, she stood up calmly. fixed her hair, straightened her blouse, and welcomed the officers with a serenity that came from deep within. From the soul of someone who's taken life's punches without ever losing her grace. She answered every question with clarity and strength. She showed them the pantry with food, Clara's medication, the prescriptions, the medical reports. There's no luxury here. But there is love. And that heals more than any hospital empty of affection, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. The agents hesitated. They had expected chaos, but found care. They had expected neglect, but found vigilance. Marta didn't apologize for being poor. But she also refused to shrink under suspicion. Her wisdom ran deep, rooted in generations of women who had learned how to fight with dignity, even against the system itself. Then Valenka arrived, with neatly organized folders, testimonies, receipts, and medical reports. But he brought more than documents, he brought presence. He spoke about Francisco with pride, about Marta with respect, about Clara with tenderness. They don't need pity. They need protection from prejudice. The strength of his words silenced the room. Because in that moment, it wasn't money that made the difference. It was the power of love, when love is declared as an undeniable truth. Francisco didn't know what to do when he saw the velvet case placed in front of him. It was a new guitar, its strings gleaming, the scent of fresh wood still strong. Music saved my soul. Maybe it'll save yours too, Valenka said with a quiet smile. But the real surprise came right after. Master Antunes, a retired maestro known for his strictness and brilliance, had personally agreed to take on the challenge of training the boy. Francisco, who until then had sung only by instinct, was about to dive into the world of art, with discipline and pain. The first few days felt like walking barefoot over shattered glass. Antunes accepted no excuses. Every off-key note was met with a piercing look. You are not just a poor boy who sings well. You're an artist in the making. Honor that. Francisco cried. He thought about quitting. But with every tear, the technique began to sink deeper. Music, which had once been just the cry of his heart, now gained form, direction, structure. He started to understand. Feeling without preparation is a flame that burns out fast. The pain he carried became sound. But to turn sound into art, that required more. Antunes would always repeat, pain without technique is just venting. Pain with technique is a sword. And it was with that sword that Francisco began to train. Calloused fingers, sharp ears, his whole body in service to the song. The raw songs he once sang began to shine like polished diamonds. He was still a boy, but now, becoming the interpreter of his own story. And as his chords improved, something deeper grew inside him. The certainty that his voice wasn't just survival, it was destiny. It wasn't a scandal. It was a trap, quiet and dressed up as news. The article spread like a plague. Family exposed as part of emotional scam. Millionaire manipulated by sob story. Rodrigo had gone all in to turn lies into headlines. Photos taken without permission, edited clips, distorted quotes. They painted Francisco as a fraud, Marta as a manipulator, and Valenka as a gullible old man. The internet, always thirsty for drama, did the rest. What once was hope became public trial. Francisco couldn't understand how something so cruel could be so embraced. The same people who once clapped for him now spit out poisonous comments. That kid faked it all, they said. The public humiliation cut deeper than any hunger he had ever known. At school, classmates echoed the report as if it were a joke. Sing for us, little con artist, they laughed in the hallways. Music, once his shelter, became his mockery. And the silence he carried in class wasn't shyness anymore. It was shame. The light in his eyes had vanished. Antunes noticed. Valenka felt it. Marta cried quietly, trying not to let Francisco see. But the boy no longer looked anyone in the eye. He felt like his truth had been stolen. as if the world was screaming at him. You'll never escape the place you were born, and that is the worst kind of prison, when they make you doubt your own worth. That article wasn't just a lie, it was a sentence. And now, Francisco had to decide. Would he bow to the venom of deceit, or find the strength to sing louder than hate? Francisco began to walk hunched over, as if trying to disappear inside his own skin. He traded his guitar for silence, his rehearsals for sleepless nights at the window, staring at nothing. Shame moved back in like a shadow that followed him even into the shower. Maybe I should go back to the streets. At least there, no one expects anything from me, he whispered, convinced he had failed. He thought no one noticed. But Antunes heard the silence, and Valenka felt the weight in his footsteps. Until one day, his mentor decided to break the silence. Valenka called him, slowly, like someone inviting you back to life. He looked him in the eyes and said, with unwavering strength, Francisco, they don't hate you because you're poor. They hate you because you're real. And the truth terrifies those who built their lives on lies. Those words hit like a slap. Sharp, direct, freeing. For the first time in days, Francisco felt his heart beat with anger. Not anger at the world, but anger at the idea of giving up. He realized that more than hurt, he was being called to fight. And the weapon he had was the same as always, his art. Then came the invitation, or rather, the challenge, to sing at the charity gala, the very same event where he had once been mocked. But this time, not as a tolerated beggar, as the main act. The stage would no longer be a trap, but a response. Valenka knew. This was the chance to turn the tables, not with shouting or revenge, but simply by letting Francisco be who he was. Francisco took a deep breath. The urge to run still lived inside him, but something new had begun to grow, something he couldn't yet name, but it burned bright, like a flame ready to set an entire stage on fire. The gala poster had one name in bold letters, a name that no one had dared to say with respect before. Francisco, the same boy who used to push a scrap cart through the streets, was now about to take center stage. At the most luxurious event in the city, the spotlights that once ignored him would now search for him. But this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a battle waiting to unfold. In the audience sat the same people who had laughed, judged, and now waited to see him fail. He knew this wouldn't be just a performance. It would be a confrontation, a silent duel, a response. As he put on the modest suit Valenka had tailored just for him, Francisco looked at the mirror and barely recognized himself. But the eyes were still the same. Tired, deep, full of stories. With each rehearsed chord, he relived Clara's cough, his blind mother's gentle touch, Rodrigo's venomous stare. That night, he wouldn't step onto the stage to please. He would step onto the stage to exist, to prove that someone born in the gutter can shine without dimming anyone else's light. The gala wouldn't be just an event. It would be a reclamation of territory. And when his feet touched that stage, he wouldn't sing for applause. He wouldn't move for anyone's pity. He would sing for redemption. For every time he had been ignored, dismissed, wounded, he would sing for Marta, for Clara, for every invisible child who carries a voice locked in their chest. And most of all, he would sing for himself, because that night, in front of the powerful, he would no longer be the boy from the trash. He would be the sound of truth, echoing in a place no one thought it could ever reach. When Rodrigo learned that Francisco would be the featured performer at the gala, his smile curdled into poison. The jealousy that had already rotted his heart now twisted into rage. To him, Francisco was an intruder, a glitch in the system, a threat to his safe, untouchable world. Determined to not let Francisco gain an inch of ground, Rodrigo designed a trap. Cold, calculated, vicious. If the boy's weapon was art, Rodrigo would strike back with humiliation. He wasted no time. He hired bloggers and influencers who would pounce on every slip, every flat note, every trace of stage fright. Rodrigo wanted to turn that stage into a public disaster, where the poor boy wouldn't just be mocked. He'd be permanently branded as a fraud. What was meant to be the climax of Francisco's redemption became fertile ground for cruelty. Cloaked in likes, retweets, and trending hashtags, the war was about to erupt in real time. As Francisco prepared, unaware of the scheme, the backstage buzzed with conspiracy. Rodrigo didn't just want to win. He wanted to crush, to erase the truth that the boy embodied. But what Rodrigo didn't know was that Francisco's strength came from a place no video, no gossip, no smear campaign could ever touch. The courage of someone who had lost everything and still chose to sing. This battle wouldn't be just musical. It would be moral, spiritual, and the entire city was about to witness it. As the clash between Francisco and Rodrigo gained momentum, Valenka's investigators dug deeper into the dark past of the wealthy young man. What they uncovered wasn't just a spoiled rich kid with a superiority complex, but a long-hidden secret. An old accountant, now far from his former life, revealed the missing piece. Years ago, Valenka had saved Rodrigo's father from prison, using his influence to cover up a scandal that could have destroyed the family. That revelation cast a new light on Rodrigo's burning hatred. The gratitude that could have grown from it was replaced by silent resentment, a jealousy fed by shame, and the sense of a debt that had never been repaid. Rodrigo didn't just see Valenka as a rival. He saw him as a man who had chained him to an unspoken pact of humiliation. And now, seeing that same man elevate a street kid was a final, unbearable insult. His rage didn't come only from the present, but from layers of buried pain and inherited shame. For Valenka, the discovery was a shock. More than fear of consequences, he felt the responsibility to confront not just the public fight, but the ghosts hidden within that powerful family. Because this war wasn't just between rich and poor, it was between hidden truths and the masks that even time couldn't erase. And while all of that unfolded in the shadows, Francisco continued forward, unaware of the past that was quietly reshaping the future that was about to begin. Then came the invitation, or rather, the challenge, to sing at the charity gala, the same event where he had once been ridiculed. But this time, not as a tolerated beggar, but as the main performer. The stage would no longer be a trap, but a response. Valenka knew this was the chance to change the game, not by shouting, not by retaliating, but simply by being. Francisco took a deep breath. The urge to run still lived inside him. But something new had begun to grow, something he couldn't yet name, but that burned hot, like a flame ready to light up an entire stage. The gala poster bore a name that no one had ever dared to say with respect before: Francisco. The same boy who once dragged a recycling cart through the streets would now take the spotlight at the city's most luxurious event. The lights that once ignored him would now search for him. But this wasn't a fairy tale, it was a declared battle. Sitting in that audience would be the very people who mocked and judged him, now waiting for him to fail. He knew this wasn't just a performance. It was a confrontation, a silent duel, a reckoning. As he slipped into the simple suit Valenka had tailored for him, Francisco looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. But the eyes were still the same. Tired, deep, full of stories. With every rehearsed chord, he relived Clara's cough, his blind mother's gentle touch, Rodrigo's poisonous stare. That night, he wouldn't go on stage to please. He would go to become. To show that someone born in the trash can shine, without dimming anyone else. The gala wouldn't just be an event, it would be a reclaimed territory. And when his feet touched that stage, he would not sing for applause or pity. He would not move for someone else's compassion. He would sing for redemption. For all the times he was ignored, doubted, hurt. He would sing for Marta, for Clara, for every invisible child who carries a voice trapped in their chest. And most of all, he would sing for himself. Because there, in front of the elite, he would no longer be the boy from the trash. He would be the sound of truth, echoing in a place no one thought it could reach. When Rodrigo found out that Francisco would be the main attraction at the gala, his smile turned to venom. The jealousy that already gnawed at him now morphed into active fury. To him, that boy was an intruder, an outlier threatening the comfort of his untouchable world. Determined not to let Francisco gain an inch of ground, Rodrigo orchestrated a carefully crafted trap. If the boy's weapon was art, then humiliation would be his shield to destroy him. Wasting no time, he hired bloggers and influencers who would stop at nothing to capture every mistake, every off-key note, every nervous glance. Rodrigo wanted to turn the stage into a stage for failure, where the poor boy wouldn't just be mocked, he'd be eternally branded as a fraud. What was meant to be the climax of Francisco's redemption became fertile ground for malice, hidden under likes and shares. The war was about to erupt in real time. As Francisco prepared, unaware of the plot, the backstage buzzed with conspiracy. Rodrigo didn't just want to win, he wanted to crush, to erase the truth the boy represented. But what he didn't know was that Francisco's strength came from a place no video, no gossip, could reach. The courage of someone who had lost everything and still chose to sing. This moment wasn't just musical, it was moral, spiritual, and the entire city was about to witness it. As the battle between Francisco and Rodrigo intensified, Valenka's investigators dug deeper into the young rich man's shadowy past. What they uncovered wasn't just a spoiled boy with a superiority complex, but a secret kept tightly under wraps. A former accountant, now far removed from that world, revealed the missing piece of the puzzle. Years ago, Valenka had used his influence to save Rodrigo's father from prison and avoid a scandal that could have destroyed the entire family. That revelation cast new light on Rodrigo's fierce hatred. The gratitude that could have grown from that moment had instead turned into silent resentment, jealousy fed by a sense of unpaid debts and the shame of a hidden story. Rodrigo didn't see Valenka as just a rival. He saw him as a man who had trapped him in an invisible pact of debt and disgrace. And now, seeing that street boy elevated, he saw a living reminder of a humiliation he couldn't bear to face. His hatred wasn't born only in the present, it came from layers buried deep in the past. For Valenka, the discovery was a blow. More than fear of consequences, he felt the weight of responsibility. Not just to fight the external battle, but to face the ghosts that lived within that powerful family. This war, after all, wasn't just rich versus poor, it was truth versus the masks time had failed to erase. And while all of that unfolded, Francisco walked his path, unaware that a hidden past was shaping the future that was about to unfold before his eyes. Rodrigo was rummaging through one of his father's old desk drawers when he found a yellowed envelope, no sender, no date. Inside, a handwritten letter, shaky, filled with regret. The first line stopped him cold. Valenka, I don't know how to thank you for saving my neck. One day, I hope I'll have the courage to tell Rodrigo. It was a confession never sent. A buried outpouring of guilt. As he read the final words, Rodrigo felt the ground fall away beneath his feet. Everything he thought he had earned had been gifted through the mercy of another man. The truth cut like a blade. The mansion, the cars, the clean reputation, they only existed because Valenka once chose to silence a scandal. Rodrigo had grown up believing he was superior through merit, when in truth, his life was built on a secret that now burned like acid. It was as if every scent he inherited carried poison. And worst of all, the boy he despised, Francisco, was now standing in the very place Rodrigo feared most, in Valenka's admiration. The reflection was brutal. Francisco had become everything Rodrigo never could. That's when resentment turned into obsession. Rodrigo no longer saw just a boy singing. He saw the living image of a past he had never faced, a legacy he inherited without deserving, a moral debt his father had tried to bury in silence. Francisco had unknowingly become the cruelest mirror of a truth Rodrigo spent his whole life trying to deny. Character isn't inherited. It's built. And in that moment, staring at the letter, Rodrigo understood. His war with the boy was never about music or status. It was about identity. On the eve of the big performance, Valenka asked Francisco to join him out on the balcony of their new home. The night air was cold, charged with the kind of electricity that always comes before turning points. Without pretense, Valenka told him everything. The letter. The secret. The real reason behind Rodrigo's hatred. Francisco listened in silence, eyes fixed on the sky. He didn't look surprised, he looked understanding. For the first time, the boy realized the war was never about him. It was about the shame Rodrigo couldn't carry. So he hates me because I'm free, and he's a prisoner of a lie? Francisco asked, his voice calm, almost adult. Valenka just nodded. And that's when the boy made a decision that wasn't in any script. He chose not to sing to defeat Rodrigo. He would sing to set him free. He realized that true art doesn't answer with anger, but with compassion. That truth, when sung with a clean heart, has the power to disarm even the most hardened. Francisco didn't want to humiliate Rodrigo. He wanted to show him it was still possible to step out of the invisible prison he had built for himself. That night, Francisco slept like someone who carried a purpose. Not a plan for revenge, but a calling. The song he would choose wouldn't come from open wounds, it would come from the possibility of healing. Because now he understood. When truth becomes song, it doesn't just confront, it transforms. And maybe, in that crowded audience, where so many came expecting a spectacle of vanity, they might find something far more powerful. The presence of someone who chose to answer hatred with the one thing the world still doesn't know how to handle. Genuine compassion. The stage lights burned in Francisco's eyes like a merciless sun. The hall was packed. Eyes sharp. Cell phones raised like spears. For a split second, he froze. His hands trembled. His throat went dry. His heart pounded like a runaway drum. The urge to flee was almost unbearable. Going back to the streets would be easier, he thought, swallowing hard. But then, like a wave crashing through the silence, came the memories. Clara's cough. His mother's blind but smiling face. Maestro Antoni's stern, encouraging gaze. Right there, in the middle of the panic, Francisco found shelter. Not in the audience's silence, but in the voices that built him. He closed his eyes, drew a long breath, and positioned his fingers on the guitar. And when the first note rang out, it wasn't just music. It was a perfectly aimed arrow, launched straight at the world's pride. The song spoke of dirt floors, hunger swallowed in silence, sleepless nights under open skies. But it also spoke of love that never failed, of dignity that couldn't be bought. His voice didn't ask for applause. It offered a mirror. Each verse was an open wound, and a balm. He didn't sing to impress. He sang to expose, to heal, to remind everyone that poverty isn't the absence of worth. It's the presence of too much injustice. Some whispered. Others filmed. Many just cried. From the side of the stage, Rodrigo watched, pale, fists clenched. Because at that moment, truth didn't have to scream. It simply was. Spoken through the voice the world tried to silence, and now could no longer ignore. When the final note dissolved into the air, the ballroom hung in absolute silence. It wasn't awkwardness, it was shock. The same elite who always spoke loudly, laughed between the lines, and made the rules with raised glasses, was now speechless. The boy from the trash had silenced them, without raising his voice, without offending, without attacking. Just by existing with truth. Francisco stood under the spotlight, eyes wet, soul wide open, waiting for a verdict. And then, like an unstoppable wave, the applause began. 1, 2, dozens, hundreds. On their feet. The reaction was so overwhelming, many forgot to hit record. Some wept openly. Others clapped with their heads bowed, like people confronted by their own conscience. Even the harshest critics seemed to choke on their pre-written words. Because in that moment, there was no longer a poor boy on stage. There was an artist. A voice that cut through social defenses and spoke directly to the human inside every person there. It was impossible to pretend nothing had been felt. And no one dared be the first to interrupt that sacred silence. Off to the side, Rodrigo felt his internal kingdom collapse. He had tried to turn Francisco into a public spectacle of shame. But the only one exposed was him. The bloggers he had paid didn't even know where to point their phones anymore. Rodrigo couldn't take it. Pale, he turned his back and slipped out the back door, alone. The elite that once applauded him out of status now ignored him like he'd never existed. The boy he tried to destroy had silenced the entire gala. And he did it with the one power Rodrigo could never fake: authenticity. The morning after the gala, the newspapers carried unexpected headlines. The angel with the golden voice moves the city. Photos of Francisco, standing on stage, eyes closed, guitar clutched to his chest, filled magazine covers and phone screens. He was no longer invisible. He had become a symbol of something the city didn't even realize it needed: hope. With a face and a voice. Interview requests flooded in. Donations followed. Even the school that once mocked him now treated him like a prodigy. The media, so often the executioner, now rediscovered the beauty of truth. The Child Welfare Council, pressured by public outcry and the irrefutable evidence provided by Valenka, closed the case with a clear statement: a healthy, dignified, and well-structured family environment. Marta cried in silence, holding Clara tight in her arms, sealing the victory with a hug. The house now felt like a real home. The pantry had food. And the nights no longer ached with cold. Francisco returned to rehearsals with Antunes, more confident now, more grounded. Peace had finally arrived. Not as a guest, but as a resident. But not every victory comes without residue. Behind the curtains, whispers still stirred. Rodrigo had vanished, but a wounded elite doesn't forget so easily. There were fake smiles, sideways glances, and too many offended interests for things to stay quiet for long. Francisco could feel it in the air. Something was still unresolved. Because when truth shines, it illuminates. But it also unsettles those who've lived their lives in the dark. And his journey was only just beginning. Rodrigo returned. Not with noise, but with poison. Wounded in his pride, he couldn't swallow the public defeat. And this time, his weapon would be more sinister: a lie. He began whispering a carefully crafted rumor. That Valenka had once fathered a disabled child and secretly abandoned him. The story was pure fiction. But it had just enough cruelty, just enough plausibility, to spread like wildfire. He used the past as a backdrop, and compassion as bait. It was a trap disguised as drama. Perfect for a viral scandal. Rodrigo didn't just want to silence Valenka. He wanted to morally destroy him. And he knew exactly where to strike. At the image of honor Valenka had spent decades building. He confronted him personally, now with a threatening tone and forged documents in hand. If you don't walk away, from the boy, the press, the music, this story goes public. You'll be the villain of the city you fooled. Valenka listened in silence. Not because he believed the bluff, but because he recognized the cruelty of a man who had lost control, and would now do anything to hurt. What hurt the most wasn't the lie, but the strategy. Valenka knew. In the age of social media, truth travels slow, but mud spreads fast. A well-crafted rumor can destroy a reputation built over years. And at that moment, he stood at a moral crossroads. Should he protect his own name? Or protect Francisco, even if it cost him everything? Rodrigo, deep down, didn't just want revenge. He wanted to make Valenka ashamed of being just. And that was the kind of blow that couldn't be answered with anger, only with courage. Valenka spent the entire day buried in silence. The lie Rodrigo had spread pulsed like a wound that had never existed, yet somehow already hurt as if it were real. He thought about stepping back, about protecting Francisco, Marta, Clara, Maestro Antunes. "Maybe it's better if I disappear," he whispered. But Francisco heard him. He walked over slowly, sat beside him, and with the same calm tone he once used to sing his pain, said, "You taught me that the stage isn't for vanity, it's for truth. So go stand on your stage." A sentence spoken by a boy, but exactly what the man needed to hear. Valenka lifted his eyes, now clouded with tears. The same boy he once met hungry and invisible, was now his lighthouse. Francisco didn't speak like a student. He spoke like a voice of conscience. If you stay silent, they win. Not because they're right, but because they're cowards with microphones. It was the echo of the same truth Valenka had once used to lift Francisco up. Now the roles had reversed. And in that moment, Valenka understood. A truth that lives in silence dies. But a truth that walks on stage survives. That's when he decided. He would give a national, live interview. No filters. No spokespeople. He would tell it all, about Rodrigo, the lie, the attacks. But also about the beauty he had seen in that family. About Marta's strength. About Francisco's music. Not to defend himself, but to reveal. Because, as he would say during that broadcast, lies spread on their own. But truth needs courage to be heard. And he was ready to be that courage, live across the nation. The camera light came on. Valenka adjusted his jacket with steady hands, but his eyes carried decades of buried sorrow. The entire country was watching. Most expected justifications, rehearsed denials, maybe some cold technical defense. But what came instead was silence. The kind that prepares the heart for something irreversible. And then, voice trembling, chest exposed like never before, he began. Rodrigo lied. But unintentionally, he opened a wound I've kept hidden even from myself. Yes, I had a son. And he died 2 days after he was born. The studio froze. Valenka told everything. The complicated birth, the unexpected diagnosis. The night he held his newborn son in his arms and whispered promises he'd never be able to fulfill. He said he was never ashamed. He was afraid. Afraid to relive the pain. "I never abandoned anyone," he said. "I was abandoned by the chance to be a father." His words weren't scripted. They poured out raw, with the full weight of truth. And in that space, in front of millions, he turned the cruelest of lies into one of the most moving declarations of love the country had ever heard. With a steadier voice now, he announced, "Today, the Daniel Valenka Institute is born, named after my son. A place for invisible children, like Francisco once was. A place where no pain will be ignored." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for acceptance. He simply offered the truth. And a concrete gesture. The interview ended in silence. Not the silence of judgment, but the kind that settles when the heart realizes it has just heard something profoundly real. Valenka hadn't defended himself. He had healed. And in doing so, he healed the boy he once left behind inside himself. Minutes later, the host struggled to contain her emotions before announcing the next guest. Francisco stepped onto the stage with his guitar held like something sacred. No speech. No words. Only the respectful silence of millions, in awe of a boy who had faced the world with his soul. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the song be born. Soft, honest, lined with scars and hope. It wasn't a performance. It was a public prayer. A prayer against lies. A hymn for truth. The lyrics spoke of stones thrown, of voices that scream without knowing, of eyes that judge without seeing. But they also sang of mothers who hold on tight, of hands that build in the dark, of hearts that choose forgiveness as their final answer. The whole country paused. Night shift nurses wept through their earbuds. Rideshare drivers lowered the sound of traffic. Children watched while clutched in the arms of their grandparents. And in a quiet room, in front of the TV, a woman squeezed her eyes shut. The nurse Rodrigo had bribed to support the lie. She couldn't take it. She went to the police and confessed. It was all fake. Rodrigo had paid her to forge the medical report, to build the illusion of an abandoned child. She revealed everything, through tears. The country, already moved, now rose in outrage and reverence. The truth, once fragile, defenseless, had won. And at the center of it all, eyes still closed, Francisco kept singing. Not for personal victory, but for something greater. Because his voice no longer belonged to him alone. It now belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced by slander, and chose to answer with art. When the nurse's confession aired, whatever was left of Rodrigo's image collapsed like a rotten facade. His family's businesses cut ties. The university rescinded their invitations. Friends vanished like smoke. Even his followers on social media disappeared, as if the world had turned its face away from him. His own father, ashamed and under pressure, disowned him. Rodrigo, who once had everything, now had only silence. Not the noble kind, but the kind that falls upon those no one listens to anymore. Alone in his mansion, all white columns and hollow halls, Rodrigo wandered like a ghost of who he used to be. The marble walls, once a symbol of status, now echoed nothing but loneliness. The golden castle he had built with lies and vanity had become a prison. No admirers, no stage, no audience, no voice. He tried to justify himself in the shadows, but there was no audience left. What once had been arrogance had become a burden, and the weight of carrying your own conscience is the cruelest burden of all. They now called him the man in the empty castle, a title not printed in magazines, but whispered in the streets. Francisco continued his journey. Valenca had become a symbol of dignity, and Rodrigo was trapped in the very thing he feared most, insignificance. His downfall wasn't loud. It was slow, deep, and irreversible. Because in the end, it's not scandal that destroys a man. It's the emptiness that remains when truth finally rips the mask off pride. Francisco could have chosen the easier path. To dive into instant fame, quick headlines, and applause that fades as fast as it comes. But he knew his voice needed to be more than a passing show. He chose the greater challenge. To study classical music. To build a foundation not just for his technique, but for his soul. Whole days of practice, of reading, of relentless dedication. Not just shaping a performer, but shaping a messenger. Each chord, each note, was a step toward being not just heard, but deeply understood. While many chased the fleeting glow of spotlights, Francisco found magic in the stories hidden between staves. Composing became his way of telling the journeys he had lived and witnessed. Marta's resilience, Clara's silent strength, Valenca's courage, and his own walk through pain and redemption. His songs were more than music. They were living accounts for those willing to listen. He didn't sing to be popular. He sang to be remembered. To leave behind a legacy that would outlive trends and outlast time. And so, with humility and conviction, Francisco walked his path, far from cheap fame, but close to the true essence of what it means to be an artist. He understood that fame is a mirror, and the truest reflection lies in the lives your art touches. As the passing lights dimmed, his music grew deeper, becoming the soundtrack of souls that found hope even in the thickest darkness. After all the storms, Valenca found his truest role, not as a man alone, but as a grandfather, mentor, and friend, to Francisco and the family he helped rebuild. For 7 years, He lived each day with renewed purpose, sharing wisdom, stories, and love. The building of the Daniel Valenka Institute became his greatest work, a sanctuary where invisible children could finally feel seen, heard, and cared for, far from the cruelty of abandonment or injustice. Valenka became beloved in the community, a lighthouse guiding others not just with words, but with tangible, daily acts of kindness. He followed Francisco's every step closely, moved by each new song, each smile from Clara, each victory from Marta. His gaze carried the calm of a man who had fulfilled his mission, who had made compassion his living legacy. And even as his body began to fade, his spirit remained strong and radiant, sustained by a love that would never burn out. On that final day, as Helena softly played the piano, Valenka closed his eyes in peace. The melody filled the room like a warm embrace, and his final breaths were cradled by a symphony of gratitude and hope. He left this world knowing his story wasn't ending. The Institute would continue to shine, Francisco would continue to sing, and love, that greater love that triumphed over hatred, would never stop existing. That was how the journey ended, of a man who chose to be light in the midst of darkness. 5 years passed. Francisco, now with a more mature face and calm posture, was preparing for the most special night of his life. The premiere of his first original symphony, The Nest. It wasn't just a musical composition. It was a sonic portrait of his soul. Every movement of the orchestra narrated the journey of a boy who rose from the mud to find purpose, love, and dignity. The auditorium was full, but one seat in the front row remained empty. It would always be reserved for Valenka. The concert began with delicate sounds, almost imperceptible, like a shy breath born in the dark. Slowly, the music gathered weight, pain, tension, until it burst into notes that cried and screamed, but then learned how to breathe again. At key moments, the orchestra fell silent, as if even silence had something to say. Then came the rebirth, a bright, ascending melody that spoke of reunions, restored truths, recovered faith. The audience cried without shame. Francisco didn't need to sing. The symphony spoke for him. At the end, the entire audience rose, as if they shared a single soul. Francisco, eyes misty, looked at the empty chair. He smiled, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Valenka was there. In the music, in the moment, in the legacy. And at that instant, one thing became clear to all. Francisco no longer sang out of necessity. He sang with purpose. His life was no longer a cry for help. It was a song of second chances. And there, in front of the world, his art became eternal. Because some men write with words, others with sound. Francisco chose sound, and he turned pain into eternity.